How's it going, friends? Welcome to my channel. Today, I wanted to show you this game that I played in a blitz tournament on chess.com. I had the white pieces against phase shift, and you might be wondering, well, you're starting with this innocuous rook endgame. It's 2-on-2, both rooks, both kings, everything like that. Like, what could possibly be so special about this? And I would have thought the same thing if you just showed me the moves. It just looked like a rook endgame that ended up being a draw. But then I'm looking at game review and after the game, obviously, and I realized that after king f3, black is completely winning. And you're still probably thinking, like, well, there's no obvious tactic, there's no obvious check or capture that's going to be winning. Like, what is the sort of winning continuation there? And we'll get into it. I was very fascinated. Fascinated enough to where I wanted to make a video, but it was too complicated for me to sort of like process all into a short like I was hoping to, because the short has to be 3 minutes or less. So I just thought, why not just make a full-blown video about it, right? So king f3 is a blunder, and my opponent didn't do anything about it. He just played rook b3 check, which probably is the most logical move, just checking, trying to, get me to move in time pressure and things like that. This was a 5-0 game, by the way, 5 minutes with 0 increment, and I am clearly on the ropes as far as the clock goes, but I did end up holding the draw. So we can kind of go actually to the beginning of the game, kind of look at the lead up. We're not going to do some full-blown like analysis or like opening deep dive or anything like that. It was a Nimzo Indian. I played bishop d2 and just like standard stuff. Actually, not really. I doubt this position has ever been seen before, but anyway, I have a bad bishop, but I can definitely overcome it. I have good space and a good center to make up for it. After knight c5, I go bishop c2, and I take with the queen. And I do get an advantage at some point. I get my rook to the 7th, my opponent goes knight b6. And here, this is where I misplayed it a little bit. I play queen e3, offering a queen trade, but then that gives away the c4 pawn, which attacks the pawn, the other pawn as well. And then, now he's attacking my bishop as well as all my other pawns. So what I should have done, I think, is just taken on b7. I think there's a difference here. I just kind of gobble the pawn on c7 as well. And this is much more straightforward. I now have an outside pass pawn and everything like that. But anyway, didn't do that. Obviously, in a blitz game, I just played queen e3, trying to trade queens, and eventually just windled, is that a word? Winded down into this endgame, which should be a draw. I do get my pawn to b7, but my opponent's able to hide his king on h7, so there's no way for me to kind of like go check and like queen the pawn or anything like that. I mean, part of me is hoping he gets like overly ambitious, maybe at this point plays like king f5 or something like that, trying to join the pawns. Then I go rook f8 check and then queen, but obviously my opponent is way smarter than that. So eventually I just went after this pawn and then went after the other pawn. We traded. I threw in a check first, he threw in a check as well, and a few moves later of just shuffling, this is the position we got after this move, king f3. So, it's completely winning for for black. But why? Well, the main problem, actually, I'll give you a couple seconds. If you want to pause the video, I doubt it's going to be difficult to kind of just like there's not some like clear answer. You have to see some concepts and then just kind of like see the accurate moves to get to that point. So I'll let you pause the video just in case you want to see what's going on. But yeah, I will take a sip of my water. All right. Well, if you want to keep looking at the position, feel free to keep the video paused. So basically what's going on here is the big problem in my position is the placement of this rook. The rook cannot go forward because, obviously the g-pawn's blocking it, right? And now that my king's on f3, the rook cannot go sideways. But also, in some variations, my rook has problems defending the g2 pawn. So after this move, king f5's winning for black for a couple reasons. Well, one, now the king is closer, so theoretically he's taking away more squares and things like that. But also, my king is almost out of squares, and I have very little moves to begin with now. Because if my rook is like here or something, then I can just like shuffle, go check or whatever. But my rook is very misplaced on g3, so I don't have that same flexibility. And we can go ahead and eliminate a couple of moves. If I go rook h3, then there's g4 check, just winning the rook. And obviously that would be very cleanly winning. And if I try to free my rook by going like rook g4 or something, then there's rook b3 check. attacking the king, which is protecting the rook. I'd have to move the king away, and then the rook would be gone. So what are the logical tries after king f5? Well, I could try to push my pawn, my h-pawn that is, to h3 or h4, or I can move my king. If h4, I think h4 is probably the most logical looking move to try to entice takes, in which I could just like move my rook up, and finally my rook is free. But after h4, my opponent would not take the pawn. He would be able to go g4 check, and obviously if rook takes g4, my king is still kind of stuck with my rook, so there's rook b3 check, winning the rook. And after king e3, my opponent here can go h5, and I have kind of a Zugzwang type problem to where it's like my rook can't move, and then if my king moves, the only other moves I can play are king d4 or king d3, but either way, my opponent goes king f4, and he's attacking my rook, which is protecting my pawn, and there's nothing I can do about it. I go rook a3, and then he can either take the pawn, or, I mean, computers even say, like, g3 is also a move, just like, I mean, it's all gonna, the order doesn't really matter, right? I mean, he can even just take, then you go, like, g3, kind of walk towards the h-pawn, and that would be completely winning. So that is if h4. There's g4, then h5, then my king would kind of be forced to move. There's sort of a similar idea. If I were to go h3, my opponent here would go h5, because, and once again, he's threatening to go g4, and just kind of like kick my king away. And then I go h4. There's also something to be said with king e3 kind of immediately, which we'll kind of get to here in a second. I believe after just king f5, king e3. But after this move, h5, if I try to go h4, obviously we know if takes, I just free my rook, and that would be a draw. If g4, king e5, sorry, king e3, I thought this was pretty fascinating. There are multiple, like, individual winning moves here, but I think the cleanest one, this is just a textbook example of a Zugzwang, like, quite literally, king e5. And king e5 is quite simply losing for white, because there are no legal moves that don't lose material, like, literally. You can't move the rook. And the only king move, because of the placement of the black king and the rook, and the pawn, that is, the only move is king d3, which loses to rook b3 check, and the rook is gone. So again, you kind of see this concept of like the rook being restricted, so therefore black just kind of like gives you the move towards like you can't really do anything with it. You can't do anything that doesn't self-destruct, right? So, you know, and then after king f5, if king e3, this is kind of the final variation. We looked at, you know, h-pawn, looked at h3, and obviously as well as the other moves, but if we go king e3 here, then my opponent would have gone g4. g4, and the idea is that, again, you're kind of in the Zugzwang situation to where you either, well, you can move the h-pawn, but then, like, you could go h3, but then they go h5, and after takes, you're kind of in the same pickle to where your king has to move. Just kind of crazy. Like, there's, the only moves would be either here or here. I mean, we'll get to that here in a second, but essentially the problem is black can go king f4, and then after king c3 or rook f2, there's just this h5, h4 coming, and there's literally nothing you can do about it. Like, now you can move your rook, or I guess I can move my rook, I could say, but then black can take, and then take the h-pawn, and that would be completely winning. So, yeah, all that to say, I think those are all the variations. So basically, if black had gone king h5, and then, you know, just depending on what I play like h5, g4, and then kind of put me in a Zugzwang, then that would have been winning. Which I thought was crazy, because I thought it was crazy that, like, a rook endgame 2-on-2, where there's not, like, a super obvious weakness or anything like that, is completely losing for me. So, there's your rook endgame lesson for the day. I mean, I was kind of like, my mind was blown just kind of like looking at this. So, if you have any questions or comments about the position, feel free to leave them in the comments. Just let me know. And if you enjoy videos like this and would like more instructive content, feel free to subscribe to my channel. We're slowly growing, trying to get to 300 here very soon. And yeah, thank you all so much. Hope you all have a great weekend, and I will talk to y'all soon. Peace.